Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is embroiled in controversy. While the recently released animated Spider-Man film that acts as a sequel to the Oscar-winning Into the Spider-Verse has experienced major box office success, huge critical acclaim, and is personally one of my favorite movies of the year, an uglier aspect of its existence was recently revealed, and that aforementioned uglier aspect is that the film's animators were often mistreated, overworked, and burnt out. In a damning report, Vulture, no relation, spoke with 4 animators who worked on Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, and those said animators detailed an unsustainable working environment and project mismanagement, particularly from producers and writers Phil Lord and Chris Miller, more so than the film's actual directors. According to the report, Lord and Miller did not have an exact vision of what they wanted from Across the Spider-Verse's various animators from the outset of the project. In fact, a running theme throughout this piece was that Lord and Miller, though Miller reportedly wasn't as involved as Lord in this project, often didn't have a concrete idea as to what the vision of the movie was and would be something that they'd figure out in the editing process. A great movie was something that they would discover as the production went on. And this created issues for the animation department from the project's outset. In fact, Across the Spider-Verse's production problems started in the layout stage, i.e. when the first 3D representations of storyboards are created. During this time, workers spent approximately 3 to 6 months doing nothing, meaning that despite being paid to be present, they had no work to do. Which admittedly doesn't sound too bad until you realize that there's eventually an effort to catch up for lost time, because there were deadlines to be met once filmmaking began in earnest. Deadlines that were rapidly approaching because, let me remind you, the animation team reportedly spent 3 to 6 months sitting idle with nothing to do, yet now had a deluge of work and responsibilities that they had to complete by a set certain date. Once there were set objectives and tasks to complete, the animators would have to overwork themselves to both hit those aforementioned deadlines and to also meet Lord's very specific demands and requests. And to be clear, Lord requested a lot of fucking revisions, even on highly detailed animated work that had already been approved. Hell, animators might have had to revise their work 5 times in the final rendering process alone, which meant there was a lot of detailed and completed animated work that would eventually just be trashed due to how Lord would say that he needed a revision. And given that Across the Spider-Verse's animation style is so heavily detailed, that's a lot of damn work that's just left on the cutting room floor. That's just a lot of time, love, and effort that animators had spent on something that ultimately turned out to no longer be viable, which was reportedly demoralizing in and of itself, because obviously. And thus the animators would have to start over, but with a tighter deadline as a planned release day approached. One that was pushed back numerous times because, as we all know, Across the Spider-Verse was delayed numerous times. And given that the behind-the-scenes workings on this movie was such a shit show, we can now see why that was the case. These animators reportedly worked 11-hour days and over 70 hours a week with minimal days off for roughly a year. And in essence, they crunched hard. In fact, the working environment was so stressful that it reportedly caused approximately 100 animators to leave Across the Spider-Verse's animation team throughout the course of the film's production. And even with a massive team with roughly 1,000 animators, that's a lot of turnover. That's a large amount of animators who thought that Across the Spider-Verse's creative process was just too much stress to handle. They just couldn't endure that type of grueling mismanagement. But still, even with that, many animators still stayed, though not necessarily due to company or project loyalty, but rather to ensure that their work would survive and make the final cut of the movie. Something that, if they departed the company before the project was complete, might have not happened because, as stated earlier, Lord and Miller find their creative vision through the editing process and will trash completed work and make animators start again, over and over again. If animators abandoned the project in mid-development, it's very probable that their work wouldn't end up in the final cut of the movie, given that Lord and Miller's editing process goes very snippy. If anything, the incentive for many animators to stay on the project was based out of fear of all their work amounting to nothing, rather than love for the aforementioned project, which is just not an optimal or a healthy working environment. It's not a good look for this movie and the people that managed it. And to be clear, yes, animated movies and films in general often take a shit ton of effort to complete, and a lot of that work that makes it into a completed project are revisions, rewrites, reshoots, and etc. Something that goes beyond a film filmmaker's best laid plans. And admittedly, Across the Spider-Verse's higher-ups viewed this film, the workers beneath them, and the need for constant revisions as an extension of that. That Across the Spider-Verse, like any other film or animated project, needed a lot of revisions, edits, and corrections that ultimately made the project challenging yet rewarding. Hell, Amy Pascal, the former Sony Pictures Entertainment chairperson who is also now a producer for Across the Spider-Verse, agreed with this sentiment. Per Pascal, one of the things about animation that makes it such a wonderful thing to work on is that you get to keep going until the story is right. If the story isn't right, you have to keep going until it is. End quote. Pascal also responded to former workers criticizing the management of Across the Spider-Verse by stating, "I guess welcome to making a movie." End quote. But here is the thing. Even by the standards of other films, and hell, other animated movies, Across the Spider-Verse, and quite frankly other Phil Lord and Chris Miller projects, or at least projects they're attached to, because to be clear, according to the Vulture article, Lord and Miller have a bad reputation amongst the industry's animators, are especially egregious when it comes to taking advantage of animator creativity, and thus demoralizing them through poor project management. And while sure, the process that Lord and Miller operate under has created some certifiably great films, these films succeed at the expense of the people working on them, and honestly highlights the need for unions in this field in order to better protect workers from this type of occupational burnout. And while sure, animation studios in Hollywood have slowly but surely begun to unionize, unfortunately Sony Pictures Imageworks, i.e. the company that does the animation for Across the Spider-Verse, is not one of these unionized companies, meaning that Across the Spider-Verse's animators did not have protection from a reportedly toxic working environment. And that's awful, because truly an artist's work should not be taken for granted, and a studio shouldn't burn through its talent like CO2 burning through the fucking ozone layer. Across the Spider-Verse's animators deserved better. Additionally, I find this development to be personally disappointing, mostly because I love Across the Spider-Verse as a movie and found a lot of meaning inside of its various themes and humorous jokes. As a product, it's fan-fucking-tastic. But honestly, that is all the more reason to call out Sony Pictures Imageworks and the mismanagement on this project. After all, it's easy to criticize detestable companies whose bad business practices negatively impact the arts that they produce, so it's arguably even more important that we criticize project mismanagement on movies, games, and such that did turn out to be good, Naughty Dog, because that's honestly showing compassion for the workers who had endured absolute bullshit conditions in order to make an artistic piece. Even a really good artistic piece at that. Because while art can be cherished for having resonant meaning to those who experience it, we just cannot forget that the workers, not just the directors and project leads, but the people underneath them, helped create that aforementioned artistic piece that we cherish and deserve to be treated compassionately and with empathy. Because without these workers, the arts that we love just would not be the same. And this is true for Across the Spider-Verse's animation teams as well. Because honestly, these animators put their heart and soul into this film and did not deserve to endure a year plus of grueling crunch. They should have been treated with more respect here. On one final note, I want to mention that Across the Spider-Verse's project mismanagement runs counter to the film's themes itself. As stated in my previous video essay on Across the Spider-Verse, the movie champions the idea of inclusivity and having empathy for others. Yet with that said, the project management of Across the Spider-Verse did not offer that same empathy to those workers that it exploited, and I find that kind of upsetting. After all, if you're going to do a movie or another project about inclusivity and the inherent empathy that comes with inclusivity, you should probably have all of your bases covered. Some boxes should have been ticked. Like for a seemingly unrelated example, but I promise it's relevant, the show Barry was about awful, toxic, and downright abusive people, yet the way in which showrunner Bill Hader reportedly ran his set was efficient and respectful to the workers on the project, because to be clear, a show criticizing toxic people obviously should not have a toxic set, and thankfully Bill Hader, as of this reporting, had his bases covered. But unfortunately, I cannot say the same for the production of Across the Spider-Verse, because if it really wanted to embody a story about inclusivity and the empathy that comes with that, the project managers of Across the Spider-Verse should have respected the time and effort of their workers more. They should have been more empathetic. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me what you think of this controversy. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. $1 a month gets you onto this credit sequence, and $5 a month allows you to make requests for movies you'd like for me to talk about on the Riley and Friends podcast. The link to my Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, particularly my high tier ones in Samantha Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.